Just recently, I had the great privilege of having breakfast with Father Robert Spitzer, who is the intergalactically smart Jesuit who some years ago ran Gonzaga University as president, now runs the Magis Institute on Faith and Reason. Just a delightful human being, and as I say, a remarkably smart fellow. He's written now a series of books. It'll be either a quartet or a quintet when he's finally finished. I read actually volume 2 of it, which is called The Soul's Upward Yearning, and we spent a good couple hours discussing that book and drawing out implications from it. I think it's the best answer out there to what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls the buffered self. Now, what's that? Well, Taylor says that prior to, let's say, 1500, everybody felt that we had a sense of connection to the transcendent, to God, and that without that connection, we couldn't really find meaning or happiness. Prior to 1500, almost everybody felt that way. Beginning 1500 and now coming up to today, you have armies of people who don't believe in God and who feel that you can be, happy within the confines of this life alone. And Taylor's book is about what happened, how did that take place. But that image of the buffered self stays with me a lot. I think a lot of people today, especially young people, are getting caught within that self. It's this world, what science can describe, ordinary experience, that's it. Well, what Spitzer does in this book, I think very cleverly, is he takes from literature, from philosophy, from physics, from achingly high epistemology, all these different sources, indications of the transcendent. He punches holes through the buffered self to let in the light of the transcendent. Now, I think there's a brilliant idea on practically every page of this book, but I'll just focus on 3 areas I think are quite important. The first one is the appeal to an experience of the transcendent, which can be found really transhistorically, transculturally, and was described in the 20th century by some really major figures. Maybe the most famous of whom is Rudolf Otto, early 20th century figure who had a huge influence on a lot of the theologizing in the 20th century. But Otto maintained that, again, cross cultures and cross time, people have had an experience of what he called the noumen, or the sacred. He also famously described it as the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery at one and the same time frightening, tremendum, et fascinans, et fascinating. A sense of that reality which overwhelms our receptive capacities, overwhelms what we can know, frightens us. Think of the Bible talking about it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But even as it frightens us and overwhelms us, it intrigues us and compels us and draws us into itself. This experience is practically universal and gives access, Otto said, to this transcendent reality. Look at someone like Paul Tillich, who followed Otto quite closely. He talks about the various concerns that we have with the things around us. But then he talks about an ultimate concern. There's something that presses upon us with an ultimate, unconditioned power. Or think of C.S. Lewis, who knows about all the various longings we have, for various things and various worldly goods. But then there's this longing for ultimate fulfillment, this aching sense of the more that lies beyond what we can see and master and accomplish. And he uses the word joy. It's wonderful. Joy is this really aching sense of longing for what we can't get in our ordinary experience. This gives us access, these 3 people would say, and many others too, to a properly transcendent reality. Now, Spitzer knows that critics will emerge to say, well, what if all that's just a bunch of subjective fantasy or just a projection of your desires and so on? Well, the answer to that is this particular desire is for something properly unconditioned, absolute, final. And see, therefore, it can't be sequestered simply in the confines of one's subjectivity, because so to sequester it would be to render it ipso facto conditioned or limited or finite. It must transcend the split between the subjective and the objective. And so it's a very real contact with the unconditioned reality. So there's the first kind of trajectory that he describes, in a lot of detail, by the way. Here's a second one. And if you like really high abstract philosophizing, you'll love this part of his book. It's about how the transcendent is accessed through the very process of human knowing. Now, look at people like Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, John Henry Newman. They all reflect on this. But Spitzer puts the focus on his fellow Jesuit, the 20th century philosopher Bernard Lonergan. And Lonergan is fascinating. I've loved him for years. Lonergan talks about the dynamics of any act of knowing. He says that any act of knowing, so my knowledge of what's in this room, my knowledge of ancient history, or whatever it is, takes place always within a heuristic context of what can be further known. That lovely word heuristic is from the Greek heurisko, I look for. The mind curiously knows what it's looking for when it goes about its work. So every act of knowing takes place, and then there's a further seeking. The mind wants more. You know the experience, any scientist or a philosopher, anyone's had this, that when you answer one question satisfactorily, the mind doesn't just stop and go to sleep. Rather, 10 new questions emerge. There are 10 new things I need to know. Well, what made possible what I just answered? So I've explained a phenomenon. Great. Well, what explains that? The mind keeps asking, why? It pushes on. And finally, Lonergan says, it's pushing on toward the perfectly intelligible. In his language, knowing everything about everything. When every possible question is answered, that's what the mind wants. That means the mind is always already, in every one of its particular acts, inchoately in the presence of the perfectly intelligible. Well, what's the perfectly intelligible? That is the unconditioned reality. That whose every condition is filled. That which by itself explains its own being and therefore the being of everything else. That which adequately will answer any and every possible question. That must be inchoately operating in the mind when the mind does any of its work. To put that in religious language, the mind is always searching for the beatific vision or the vision of God. Thomas Aquinas said, in every particular act of knowing, God's existence is implicitly co-known. See, that's what he means. As my mind knows any particular thing, it's taking place within the heuristic horizon of all that can possibly be known. The answer to any question takes place in the context of the implied answer to any question, to every question. This is an epistemological route to God. Notice, please, how it starts with any act of knowing, not theological knowing. It's any scientist, any philosopher, any psychologist, any physicist asking and answering questions is doing so finally within a transcendent context. Well, if you think these first two approaches are a little on the abstract side, even though I think it's very important for us to explore these more abstract dimensions of the endeavor, but if you find them a little too abstract, consider a third proposal by Robert Spitzer, namely the analysis of near-death experience. Now, most of us know what I'm talking about here. These experiences have been studied carefully, scientifically, for the past roughly 40 years. And this is not just, casual anecdotal kind of evidence. These have been very carefully analyzed from all sorts of angles, including the high scientific angle. Again, most probably know the features. People who have experienced, the stopping of their heartbeat, or by most indications they have entered into clinical death, have these extraordinary experiences, usually involving leaving their own body and seeing it from some higher point of vantage, being able to describe with remarkable accuracy what's around them, let's say in the hospital room, usually journeying then toward a light identified as a very benign, compassionate power, often meeting deceased loved ones along the way. So again, a remarkable consistency in the description of these experiences. Spitzer knows well the critics who have emerged to say, look, it's just, these are hallucinations, these are epiphenomena of a dying brain, these are the result of oxygen deprivation and so on. Well, counter-arguments, though, abound here. because the accuracy with which people report what was in the immediate environment of their death is hard to explain on simply internal brain grounds or hallucination grounds. When people could say precisely who entered the room and when, doctors that they had never met before, able to give their names and their physical descriptions, etc. The most remarkable one to me, I had read about this, but Spitzer rehearses it. This is a woman who left her body in near-death experience, saw the room she was in, described it very accurately. Then she said she moved out of the room and down the corridor and down another couple corridors and then out the wall of the hospital on the other side of where she was. She saw then on the ledge of the hospital a single gym shoe that someone had left, a single gym shoe that was, I think it was red in color, and then one of the laces was configured in an odd way and went under the shoe. And she reported all of this when she came to. And so somebody actually went to that site, looked out the window, found the gym shoe exactly as she had described it. Well, I agree with Spitzer. That's pretty hard to explain, simply on the grounds of hallucinations or brain fantasies. Something else now that I didn't know that I find fascinating. Spitzer claims that a lot of studies have shown that people born blind, they've never seen ever in their life. They don't know what color is. But yet, some of them have near-death experiences and come back with vividly visual and colorful descriptions of what they've seen. I don't know how you explain that, simply on the grounds of hallucinations and so on. So that's a way that's not so achingly abstract, but very experiential. And I found in my own pastoral work, when you scratch the surface, you start telling a story about near-death experience, they come flooding out of people. Many, many people have had them. And he thinks, and I find this compelling, that this is a way, or I should say it coheres very much with these more philosophical modes of apprehension. That if we are already in touch with a transcendent dimension, are we surprised that at near death we find this point of contact? Okay, those are three things from a very rich book. There's much more in it. And as you undoubtedly guessed by now, I'm a big fan of the book, urge you to read it. But also, once you've read it, please give it to a bright young person who maybe has been soaking too long in the acids of contemporary skepticism and materialism, who's been too long in the musty confines of the buffer itself and needs to punch a few holes in it.